I think I've mentioned Gun Owners America a few times in podcast episodes, T-Rex Labs videos, T-Rex Arms videos, but Gun Owners of America is working really hard on a bunch of projects right now with a new administration in the White House, a new director of the FBI who is also the acting director of the ATF. There's a lot going on, and I want to hear more about it directly from them. Well, welcome back to the T-Rex Talk Show. Today I have a guest, my friend Ben, who works at Gun Owners of America. So we've been talking recently in some of the labs content, some other podcasts, and then we sent out a political newsletter this past week about some of the stuff that the Trump administration is doing. But Ben, I think Gun Owners is doing some of the best work in this space, and there are other lobby groups that specify, they have a pretty narrow thing that they do, but Gun Owners of America does a lot. You're doing a lot locally here in Tennessee. You're doing a lot nationally in the courts. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening on the national sphere specifically? And then I'm sure we'll get into a bunch of stuff.
Well, first off, Isaac, I want to say thank you for having me. It was really great to meet you all those years ago, and to be on the show is awesome.
Yeah. So my family has been involved with GOA for a long time. Actually, before we get into the nitty gritty, how did you start at GOA? When did you begin, and how did you get into this work?
It's kind of funny. I've been a gun owner since I was about 18, and I really didn't get into the lobbying side until about halfway through college, when I'm local to the area, so the Northern Virginia area, and I realized, hey, I need a internship, and none of the other places were like really all that interesting. I looked at being a congressional intern, or looked at a different lobby group, and it just wasn't exciting or necessarily fulfilling for me. And then I found Gun Owners of America, and it's funny, I actually private messaged my current boss on LinkedIn, and I'm like, hey, do you guys have any internship opportunities available? I'd love to, come and work for you and see how it's done on this side of the aisle. And he said yes, and so about 4 or 5 years later, here I am. I'm actually the deputy director. So it's been a crazy journey, but it's been an amazing one as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, has it been as exciting as you hoped for?
There's been some good times and some bad times. I can never say it's a dull or boring job. They're definitely different. I started during the pistol brace, actually, the pistol brace ban. That was the first thing I got thrown into was, hey, take a look at this bill and see what you think about it. And it's like, how do we counter what Biden's doing?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's been fascinating to see the way that things have developed over the last few years. But I remember gun owners being kind of the mirror image is too strong a word, but like every time that the National Rifle Association back in the 90s would like decide that it was not like they couldn't quite be brave enough to take a certain position, Gun Owners of America would step in, or maybe NRA would step out of the way, and GOA was like, we've always held this position and we're still here. So that's what I remember pretty vividly about the 90s. And the 90s were a dark time with Clinton assault weapons ban and various ATF actions that we've talked about in the past. But things are interesting now, too. There's pretty fascinating stuff happening in gun culture developing in America to where people are a ridiculous number of people own guns in a good way. Just a huge number of people own firearms, are continuing to buy firearms at a high rate, are continuing to be interested in very explicitly defense-related firearm usages. BJ Campbell told me something at SHOT Show. He was like, so we've obviously already won, and the other side just hasn't checked the scoreboard. And he said, Isaac, you got to stop saying that there's more than 500 million guns in America. You have to start saying there's more than 500 million guns in America. That's the way that you got to describe this. So while this is happening, while the culture of America has decided that we're going to be a little more deliberate about firearm ownership and use, we have seen in the national sphere, particularly in the last 4 years, a lot of crackdowns. Or attempted crackdowns, because you guys have pushed back on a lot. There's been a lot more legal action in the last few years, especially post-Bruin. Lots of legal action. So, yeah, what's happening now? We got a new president, a new administration, starting to get the cabinet all set up. How are things looking?
Well, first off, just starting at the very beginning, you were talking about the 90s. It's really been an honor to work for Gun Owners of America because everyone that's worked here before holds the same exact position they do now. It is the no compromise mission that has brought us here. And it's really great to see a lot more people getting into that mindset and really looking at how the Second Amendment means the Second Amendment. It means the right to keep and bear all arms. And we're not concerned about whether there's a sporting purpose for this or whether there's too many bullets in this magazine, et cetera, et cetera. It is fully based on, no, this is your right to have it. It's great for me to say that. There's people who I work with on a daily basis who have more time in this industry in lobbying for the Second Amendment than I have years alive. So it's truly an honor to work with them. But yeah, you're exactly correct. There's been a lot of legal action, especially during the Biden administration, where the anti-gun groups really took control and pushed both the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosive agency to push out their rules, as well as from the White House starting their gun violence prevention office. Excuse me. And it's been a really coordinated effort on their side, and so now it's kind of our turn to really push back. The Trump executive order on the Second Amendment is a great starting place for this administration. Really, it's one of the best things we could have hoped for. It allows the people, so everyone listening to this, you and myself included, to make our voices heard on what we want to restore the Second Amendment. Otherwise, there's a chance that instead of listening to us and listening to the people, they do something that it doesn't impact that many people, but it sounds good for the overall population, or they do something in the wrong way. And you were talking about those cases that we all have. Interestingly enough, the current DOJ career people are actually trying to mess with a few of our cases. The biggest one would probably be the engage in the business rule, in which some of the career attorneys there tried to stay our victory, meaning that they tried to essentially end the court process without giving us and also Pam Bondi the opportunity to continue it out and to set really good precedent. Instead, it would just mooted it and left it to just the 5 states that are currently covered. So this is basically President Trump taking a breath and saying, hey, what do I need to do to restore the Second Amendment for all Americans? Which is great, and we applaud him for that.
So I made a video, a YouTube video talking about that a little bit, but we're coming up close on the deadline. We're recording this on March 3rd, and I believe that the deadline is probably not actually March 9th. I think that the Attorney General has to have a plan by March 9th. So the days to actually get feedback in there are probably pretty limited. What do you recommend that people do? Before we go any further on the conversation, what is the best way for people to make their voices heard on this issue?
The best way to make your voice heard is to go to gunownersamerica.org. We have a bunch of alerts. We have a bunch of form letters that you can send to the White House. It's also contacting your local congressmen, your senators, and passing the message on through them. There is a vested interest in these congressmen to get reelected. And if they want to get reelected, they know they have to appeal to their voters. And if you make your voice heard as a gun owner and a voter, they're more likely to bring that up the chain and talk to them as like, hey, President Trump, I know that you want to do all these great Second Amendment things. Here's what the voters in my district want, and that's going to help me win this election, and that's going to keep pushing everything forward. So it really is focusing on their desire to be reelected and their desire to stay in Congress. And the only way they can do that is if they serve the people.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of an interesting thing that we're seeing. I think a lot of us have this assumption that there's two sides to this fight between, or this conflict, or the friction between the government and the people, and that is regular folks like us and the elected politicians. But the elected politicians often have a lot more in common and a lot more contact with the regular people, particularly their own constituents, than some of those career folks that you mentioned inside the Department of Justice. Like the people that have a unelected job within the government, those folks are the ones that are it's the easiest for them to get out of touch with what the regular folks want because they're not dependent upon votes. Their directors will be appointed by guys who wins elections, but there's going to be tens of thousands of people that work in some of these departments or these agencies or these bureaucracies where they will never get swapped out from administration to administration, and they can get really specifically focused on an area of their job and be completely out of touch with what the people want. And if they work inside of D.C., we kind of know which way the ideology goes. If you look at the way that Washington, D.C., the district voted, it's incredible how blue that district is. Like, it just shows kind of the mindset of the folks that work inside of D.C. for the government, get a paycheck from the government, et cetera. That's the area where I think we've had the most conflict or friction or the least amount of connection with folks when we talk about this issue, particularly the Second Amendment.
Oh, 100%. If I can just bring up an example from one of our lawsuits, we had an ATF bureaucrat who posted on his Facebook that he loved shutting down gun stores. That was one of his favorite things. And in the hearing on the FFL license denial, which is a whole topic on zero tolerance, which we can get into later, he said that after looking at the book, he said, you're definitely getting shut down. This isn't someone that's just doing their job. This isn't someone looking for errors and actual criminals. He's actually looking for reasons to shut this gun group down first, or this gun store down first, and then pretending that's what he's doing afterwards is taking down criminals.
Yeah.
And that's a huge issue. That's not about public safety. That's about a vendetta against the Second Amendment.
Right. Yeah. And there's I've met some ATF agents that I really enjoyed talking to, and I've appreciated a little bit where they're coming from. I met a guy a while back who did not want to be part of the ATF, but when they became the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, as soon as they were given the explosives jurisdiction, he got transferred from where he was working into the ATF, and he was not super happy about it. But it was all of his training. He wanted to catch bombers. He wanted to do the investigation, so he stayed. And then eventually they moved him into other areas that made him even grumpier. So the good news about this gentleman was he was self-aware enough that he understood that his grumpiness was not the fault of the FFL holders, and he was easier to deal with than some other folks that we've interacted with. But yeah, you get all sorts of guys, and some of them are interacting with regular folks. I use that, oftentimes people who hold FFLs are not exactly what I would call regular folks, but they're interacting with regular folks more often than some of the folks that work back in the offices in Martinsburg, West Virginia, or in the DC office. So it's very easy to get completely disconnected from what real people are doing. And just go down this other track. And, you said this happens sometimes in business. You get mission creep in businesses because you tell some people like your KPIs or your key performance indicators are going to be this thing, go do this thing. And they get really focused on that. And then they come back and you say, oh, are you still doing that? We actually need to make money now. That doesn't make us money anymore. It's like, well, that's what we're doing. 90% of our time is doing this thing that doesn't make money anymore because that's the goal that you gave us as opposed to the larger company goal. I think that happens in bureaucracies all the time, especially when making money was never something they needed to worry about to begin with. You can get this kind of mission creep. And I think that the Biden administration was very upfront about wanting more revocations of FFLs. I think that was a very clear message that was sent down the chain.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a perfect metaphor for what the Biden administration did with the ATF, is push down all these edicts on every single level from middle management all the way down to the field agents at the very bottom. And it makes it hard for individuals like the gentleman you talked about to just want to do their job in the best way possible to actually protect public safety. It's funny, we hear about breweries and whiskey distilleries who also have to deal with the ATF, but they say their ATF agents are friendly and are just saying, hey, we just want to make sure what you're selling is safe. It's not going to hurt anyone, and we're here to help you produce the safest product possible. And it's complete opposite when you talk to FFLs and the firearms agents. But you're right, it is coming down from the top to the bottom, and it does empower individuals who have anti-gun opinions to act out on these edicts rather than protecting public safety, rather than helping FFLs, rather than working with the American gun owners. And we're hoping to change that this administration.
Yeah, because the way that the ATF has been running in the past few years, there's definitely several benefits to shutting down FFLs. Number one, there's fewer of them to audit. But number two, when an FFL is shut down, they have to give all their records to the ATF. So the ATF has been building this illegal database. It's legal for them to collect the paper records, but it's illegal for them to build a registry. And they've built this very large digital database now of scanned paperwork that is searchable. So every time they shut down an FFL, they are able to build their database bigger. So that's the second benefit to shutting down FFLs, making it harder for people to actually purchase firearms locally.
Yeah, Isaac, I'm glad you brought up the registry. That's been something we've been working on for 4 or 5 years now. We found it through a FOIA request that our lawyers did. Before, they had about 900 million. By now, based off the estimates of how many F-4473s they're filing and digitizing, it's well over 1 billion, and they're all stored in Martinsville, West Virginia, and that's a huge infringement on American Second Amendment rights. It's also something that they're doing against the will of Congress and the Firearms Owners Protection Act. And it's a major issue. We finally got our first Senate companion bill to the no registry rights by Representative Michael Cloud. It's Senator Reisch. So it's a really great bill. It's going to force them to not only destroy all the records, but certify they destroyed it in front of Congress.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so this is the kind of thing where there's a million different places we could go, but the executive branch in particular, the Department of Justice, all the other different parts of the executive branch have this purpose to go out and execute on laws that have been made. And they have to make some rules, they have to make some regulations. So the tendency is to kind of go overboard, and then ideally, if they make more regulations, more rules around some of these laws that have been passed by Congress, the judges will kind of pull them back on that. But up until recently, I don't think there's been any pushback, not until I think it was West Virginia versus EPA. There really wasn't any pushback for these agencies to just write drastically expanded rules, drastically larger regulations on what the law actually said. And the ATF is a perfect example of this, where they have just completely reclassified what a firearm part is so that they can take the law that is actually on the books and expand that to cover way more stuff and way more people.
No, you're 100% right. The Chevron deference doctrine was definitely a thorn in the side of gun owners. I know I can say that because it essentially allowed judges to say, oh, well, the ATF is the expert here, so I'm just going to take what they say as expert opinion, no matter what, even if it was completely on its face wrong and we could prove it in court. It just required, it was an additional hill for us to get up to prove our point. But now that that's dead, these court cases on top of Bruin are really pushing everything forward and allowing us to go after a lot of the big things. But unfortunately, there are some of these smaller things which we can't do in the courts. The registry is a perfect example. It's a little bit hard to have a lawsuit on that, especially when they say they don't do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just kind of a fascinating thing. So obviously there's perfectly innocent mission creep that could happen because somebody at the ATF was told, like, scan these documents, turn them into a thing, because it's the 21st century now and electronics are a better way to do things than paper sometimes. And then there is the top-down instructions that you get from a commander-in-chief. What were some of the other things that the Biden administration did to specifically move the needle to remove rights and to impose more restrictions on gun owners?
Well, everyone knows about the pistol brace ban and the frame and receiver rule. Those were the two big ones at the very beginning of his administration. But perhaps a little bit smaller and maybe not as well known because it wasn't actually a rule, was changing ATF's policy on FFL revocations, like we talked about before. So that essentially said a small paperwork mistake, writing E0 instead of an O for the serial number, would have your license revoked as an FFL and treat you as a criminal and essentially get rid of your livelihood for writing the wrong number. And that was a major impact. And it passed down secretly through internal ATF policy. We didn't actually find out until we filed a FOIA request after a bunch of gun stores came to us and said, hey, I'm getting shut down for writing an X or writing a Q where there shouldn't have been one.
I've also heard about on the 4473s, people writing country in county and county in country, which is a thing that the gun purchaser fills out. But then the FFL guy is supposed to be the one that catches that kind of innocent mistake. Like, is that the level of stuff that people are getting busted for?
Oh, 100%. And this isn't on the individual level. It's on the licensee holders level. But it's just as ridiculous as you're saying. It's like this person, mistakenly put down the wrong order. It's like writing the date backwards. If, I was European first and I became an American citizen, if I did day, month, year instead of month, year, day, it's insane. And it shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't be targeting these paperwork mistakes and prosecuting them as if they're dangerous criminals, but instead we should be looking for ways to help them correct this and possibly even simplify the 4473 so this doesn't happen. I'd personally like to get rid of the 4473, but...
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's kind of an interesting conversation because I've had a couple of conversations with much more sympathetic ATF agents. And they said basically like, hey, we're helping you guys out because we have to be able to audit you in order for you to keep your FFL. Keeping your FFL is necessary for you to be able to sell guns to people, and we'd like you to be able to sell guns to people. So this is how what we're doing is supporting the Second Amendment. And it's like, well, we could also get rid of some of these restrictions. We could also get rid of some of these hoops. That would be way more Second Amendment friendly than just kind of maintaining the hoops and making sure that they're good and strong, and we check the hoops on a regular basis. So. Do you want to go down the rabbit trail of like what an ideal situation would look like, or should we talk a little bit more practically about who's in the White House now and what we should expect to do next? Not necessarily the ideal situation, which is of course belt-fed machine guns being sold directly out of vending machines in every major city, and how we get there is a little bit complicated.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. There is this, not dream, but our mission end is, like you said, selling machine guns out of vending machines, ending the background checks, and pushing forward so the Americans are able to exercise their Second Amendment rights without any government restrictions. And I don't want to come off wrong in saying it's not going to happen this time around. But the reality is this is a full mission. This is going to take a while. And there are certain fixable issues right now that we can go after and we can fix with this administration before tackling the big stuff. That's the same way with people asking me, why don't we just repeal the NFA right now? And I was like, I wish we could end, or abolishing the ATF. I wish we could abolish the ATF right now. But the issue remains that as part of federal law and federal statute, there are certain activities that the ATF does that if the ATF no longer exists, if we get rid of it, abolish it, that would fall to a different organization, that would fall to the FBI, that would fall to Department of Homeland Security. And that would honestly be worse because we can't watchdog in one single agency. We can't watchdog one single agent. Now instead we have to look at 10 different agencies for 10 different things, and it all gets hidden and put into counterterrorism funding and behind secrecy walls, all of that. So while our end mission is to abolish the ATF, we also need to go after the regulations and the statutes that currently empower ATF to hold on to the NFA, to hold on to all the forms, all of that.
Yeah. So we have so this is kind of an interesting thing. I actually don't know enough about the history to know about the precedent of it, but I mentioned a couple times this exact same worry that I have that you just mentioned, which is the job of the ATF gets handed to a much larger agency or bureau like the FBI, and it's much harder to keep track of what's going on. We have a new ATF acting director who is also the new FBI director. Does that mean that the plan is for them to come closer together, or does that not necessarily mean that?
Currently under federal law and the appropriations, so the funding bills that exist, it's not exactly possible for the ATF to just be willed into the FBI as a department, just like they're doing with USAID and the State Department. It's slightly different because there's specific statutes that empower only the ATF and actually say none of the funding can be used to transfer responsibilities into the FBI or any other organization. So that is definitely something we're looking at. But speaking of Director Kash Patel, he's been an awesome ally. He spoke at our conference in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was great to see you there too. But we're looking forward to working with him.
There were a bunch of people there in Knoxville that I wish that I had spent more time talking to. I had no idea that they would be in these positions just a few months later. Things happen fast sometimes.
Yeah, things are moving extremely fast in DC, and it's we're right here, we're fighting, we're doing everything. I don't think I've been in the office for more than a day at a time. Instead, we're on the Hill, just walking around, talking to everybody we can, keep working, keep pushing. So it's a lot of fun. It's fun to be on this side. It's fun to be on the busy for winning side rather than the busy on defense side.
Yes, yeah. So what do you think is going to happen with Kash Patel? Because he has, as he has this track record, and everybody that I don't trust hates him, which makes me trust him a lot more. What do you think is going to happen? Because he also now has his attention kind of divided between these two different agencies, even though I think that his the issues that he needs to look for, the problems that he needs to solve are going to be really similar across the two, probably even going to be some overlap. How do you think that's going to go?
When he talked about the FBI, he first said he wants to refocus them on the crime fighting. He wants to refocus them away from the politicization, away from the weaponization, and focus on public safety and protecting the American people. I think, and I'm hoping, something very similar is going to happen with him as acting ATF director, is refocusing the ATF away from targeting American gun owners, away from targeting pieces of, for the pistol brace, this is a piece of plastics they owned and they bought legally 10 years ago, or, the bump stock ban or the frame and receivers. Instead of trying to get into the nitty gritty and turning millions of law-abiding Americans into felons overnight, instead I'm hoping we'd focus on maybe protecting the border, maybe looking at ways to shut down cartel gun running groups that are inside America and that don't protect the Americans and don't protect the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Now, are there any things, is everything that needs to get done the really foundational systemic stuff? Does almost all that need to be done legislatively? Will there always be this 4-year back and forth ping pong game where it's just whoever's in the seat has massive control over things? Are there things that Kash Patel can do to have a lasting impact in the way that the FBI operates that doesn't just get undone when the blue team is in next?
Well, there are definitely a lot of regulations and a lot of policy changes they can make. But on top of that, yes, you're right. Legislatively, we have to move a lot of things forward. But it also is kind of an Overton window shift, and it's a public perception shift. To give you an example, last year under the Biden administration, during the appropriations and the funding bills, we actually were able to cut $122 million from the ATF, and there wasn't any crazy crime spree. And that really shut down a lot of the propaganda on, they're a law enforcement agency. We need to keep funding them. We need to increase their funding to stop all of this. Otherwise, they're going to be violent criminals everywhere with guns. And that's just not true. We proved that. We cut, it was about 13% of their budget. Half of that was for the Martinsburg facility, construction funding for their big registry building. On top of that, we also increased the amount of people they had on the e-forms and got those times down. And we specifically said, hey, if you're going to go after the ATF, you also need to put in a provision that says none of the funds or that you can't slow down the NFA approval times in order to weaponize that against gun owners. So we were able to get the wait times down, and there hasn't been any crazy violent increase with suppressors or SBRs or SBSs, anything like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's so many of these things that I believe have been completely disproven, certain talking points. So California obviously has been banning standard capacity magazines for a very, very long time, but there keep being incidents. Like when Judge Benito, was it a week? Was it an entire week where Californians could buy standard capacity magazines before another judge overturned his decision? In that week, Californians bought a gazillion standard capacity magazines. And in the years since, there has been no evidence of spiking crime. The pistol braces allow people to do everything that the SBR ban is supposed to prevent. Hasn't affected crime. Faster processing of tax stamps has done nothing for silencer crime. Like, it's very interesting. We have all of the data to point out that these talking points don't make sense. Constitutional carry does not turn your state into the Wild West. Like, more than half of the states, 28 states now, have permitless carry, and it hasn't had the effect that folks said it was going to have on crime. So with all of these things that are happening, I would hope and assume that we have a very good case that we can make to judges, to law enforcement officials in the executive branch, and to legislators that we need to fix some of the old and obsolete code and old and obsolete laws like the NFA. How do we make some of this? How do we get some more of this power to the road? How do we get some more traction on these things that seem really obvious? The offenses are more egregious, stuff like the brace rule, and then the evidence on the other side is even heavier than it was back in the 90s, say, or the 80s. We just have so much evidence of law-abiding Americans using their firearms safely, using their firearms well, wanting specific things, and those things having zero negative impact on their fellow Americans. How do we get more traction in some of this stuff?
Well, that's a great point to bring up. It's a little funny. Actually, the Biden administration pushing forward that pistol brace ban helped energize and wake a lot of the Republican congressmen and senators up to the issue of the NFA. We had 1 million people call us to be like, hey, I saw that the Biden administration is doing this. What is this about? How can we help? How do we fight this? And it really allowed us to push forward our no compromise mission and say, hey, this is the NFA. This is 100 years old. It doesn't make sense. It's a $200 tax stamps on your rights to own a barrel that is an inch shorter than what is allowed. It doesn't make any sense. The anti-gun groups are pushing all this propaganda about how it's deadlier, or how a pistol brace lets you bump fire an AR. That was an amazing conference to be part of.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. The reality is a lot of these issues for the average gun owner, and I'm 100% assuming everyone who watches T-Rex Labs is going to be on the front end of everything.
We're probably not convincing anyone of our point here. We're just trying to figure out, like, what should we be doing? Yeah.
So we are the public, and the public perception of suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, they're already well accepted. And Congress is downstream of that. All these congressmen, all of these senators, they need to hear from us, and they need to hear well thought out points. We can't repealing the NFA is a major priority. But we can't just say repeal it without bringing them the facts, like saying, hey, there's almost 2 million suppressors in circulation now, and they're not using crimes, or SBRs, or SBSs. And we talked about that with the pistol brace ban. It's like, hey, there's 40 million, quote unquote, short barrel rifles in existence in the U.S. right now. That's in 10 years. There haven't really been any crimes to match even, people's fists, or a brass knuckles,
right,
or bats, or knives. So these are not an issue. These are not something that criminals are using to escape the law. These are something that Americans are doing to go up against an unconstitutional law. And instead of having to pay $200 and register for a tax stamp, they're instead using the rights that the founding fathers gave them.
Yeah, I wonder how we lost so much ground on this issue. I think a big part of it was sort of complacency, but there, I think, was an assumption in the past that guns, even in the far distant past, guns are not something that are particularly special. Guns are just normal. Everybody just has guns. They don't need any special protections or special considerations. We don't need to remind people how big a deal they are. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, they were just kind of not given a whole lot of consideration. And then towards the end of the 20th century, all of that ground was kind of taken up by the other side, talking about how scary guns were, how abnormal guns are, what a niche issue it is. I mean, it's interesting. The NRA is simultaneously only representing the views of a few Americans and also the largest and most powerful lobby group in the entire world that owns all the Republicans. Like, depending on, the day, the size of the NRA is either nothing or everything. And meanwhile, Gun Owners of America is just trucking along, doing the work. But this idea that gun owners in America are simultaneously either responsible for all the crime, or there just aren't enough of them for it to matter. Somehow that has just kind of become an assumption in the political spheres, despite the actual numbers.
No, you're 100% correct. One of the biggest issues is potentially the apathy that a lot of gun owners feel towards the political process. And it's understandable. We've had, the Hearing Protection Act ripped away from us at the last second, and it hasn't been politically great for politicians to side with the Second Amendment. But that's exactly what we're here for, is proving to them not only is it going to help you with voters, not only is it going to help represent your constituencies better, but it also is going to make you a hero for gun owners. And that's the one thing I get asked a lot is like, oh, well, you guys are looking at lawsuits, you guys are looking at legal ways to do this. What else? What other ways are there? It's like, well, there's great ways to do it through Congress. If we do it through Congress, we can help write those bills and write them in the correct way so that it gets rid of everything forever. And we don't have to worry about a judge maybe misinterpreting Bruin in a way that we would like.
Right.
And that's really the power of the legislative branch, is the ability to restore the Second Amendment to what it originally was at founding, rather than waiting for a case to make it to the Supreme Court after 5 years. That's how long it took us for our bump stock case to reach the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting the way that this kind of goes, because there is no shortage of firearms in the United States. It's more than 500 million firearms. There's no shortage of gun owners. So this past year, 2024, gun sales were actually down compared to the previous couple years, but they were down to something like 15 million NICS, over 15 million NICS background checks, which is more than 1 million gun sales every month. So that's a quiet year. In a quiet year, Americans are buying more than 1 million guns a month. So this is a huge voting block. If it's not a huge voting block, if it's only just a couple of gun nuts, the gun nuts are the richest people in America. They're a very powerful donor class that politicians should go after. So it's just kind of interesting to me that they have such a small voice in many ways in this conversation, or such a quiet voice in this conversation. I think it is that those of us who are passionate about gun rights and those of us who are gun owners are often kind of two different groups. And there's tons of overlap, but gun owners need to be less complacent. All gun owners needed to be less complacent back in the 1950s or back in the 1920s. But even today, when there's gun rights organizations that are doing a lot, that are very visible, just regular gun owners need to also speak up and not be afraid to tell their friends and coworkers, like, "Yep, I was shooting my .22 off of my back porch this past weekend, and I didn't, no murders were committed. It was just I own these guns, and it's just as normal and less dangerous than the chainsaw that I also own." Like these kind of conversations, I believe, are pretty few and far between in America. They're mostly conversations that happen between guys like us. Mm-hmm. Like we've gone out on a limb by saying that we would like belt-fed machine guns to be in vending machines. Like that's pretty extreme. But even just saying like, yeah, I own one of these things. Like I have a short-barreled rifle that's registered, and then I have an almost identical pistol chambered in the exact same stuff with the exact same barrel length that does the exact same thing, and they're the same. Like instead of being quiet about that, people should just be a little more upfront about that with their friends and their neighbors, because I think that would go a long way. And hopefully there's a little bit more optimism and courage for the next 4 years where there is some movement on that front.
No, 100%. I learned it from my grandfather, just how to shoot a shotgun, but I didn't really get into rifles and competitive shooting or even just target shooting until I met my coworkers who took me under their wing and showed me, like, hey, here's an AR-15. This is one I own. I have an EOTech on top of it. And a 30-round magazine is perfectly normal. You can have that whenever you want. So really, it is reaching out to your neighbors. It's reaching out to your friends. It's reaching out to your coworkers and talking to them about your beliefs and your rights. Maybe don't start off with machine guns and vending machines, but say, hey, you have a right to defend yourself. You are your own responsibility. And that really resonates with a lot of people. We've seen that come up more and more, especially, when the police weren't able to respond to anything during the pandemic. We saw a lot of new gun owners that were afraid for their safety. And that's something that you can tell them is like, hey, here's how you're safe. Here's how you can protect your family, protect yourself. And you're right. Pushing that, it's all about it's the propaganda war. We're fighting against people who say you having a gun is evil, or that a certain type of gun is evil, even though you're right. It's just like the chainsaw. It's a tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just kind of normalizing them, because I think that this is I don't know if it's a chicken and egg or cart and horse problem. We kind of have two issues going on around Second Amendment, around the Second Amendment. One is that we have taken firearms, these inanimate objects, and we've put them in a different class from basically other inanimate objects. There's something that's very special about a firearm from a danger point of view. It's not treated the same way as a car or a chainsaw, even though I find those two things scarier than guns in a lot of situations, most situations. Cars kill more people per car on the road, and they carry a lot more energy in every measurement. The chemical energy in your gas tank right now is equal to an unbelievable amount of ammunition. And then the kinetic energy of, just a normal four-door sedan going 60 miles an hour on the highway. It's crazy. It's like 4 magazines of green tip. That's how much kinetic energy you have. And then you're on the highway with just like rows and rows of cars. Like, it's an unbelievable amount of energy that's out there. It's terrifying. But the way that we register cars, the way that we think about cars is very different than the way that we think about guns. And then the second issue is that we make this assumption that the government is allowed to ban certain things, control certain things, regulate certain things in people for safety preemptively. And that kind of overflows into other areas like red flag laws. So this is just a really interesting thing that really, I think, is important to bring us back to the Second Amendment and say that the Second Amendment really addresses both of these issues. Like, on the one hand, the Second Amendment does single out arms. It doesn't single out firearms, but it singles out the defensive tools and offensive tools that a militia would need to have. And therefore, the people are going to have those. And also, the government doesn't have the responsibility or even the permission to mess with these things. So the Second Amendment really, ideally interpreted, the way that it was written to be, the way that it was written to protect our rights, I think really solves both of those issues. And so, even though guns have been relegated to the small little corner of the political discourse around everything else that is usually talked about, people put on their political platforms, it really is a key foundational area, because it does require us to think about the government's jurisdiction and the people's responsibility very clearly. And so I think that even though there's a ton of political issues that we could talk about, this is just so foundational to what a government should be, what a country should be, what freedom is. Another reason for people to get more involved on this issue.
No, you're 100% right, Isaac. It's funny, even though I'm a gun lobbyist, there's some days that being into gun rights and being into gun lobbying, I need to look into different aspects. I've had to become an expert on banking law. I've had to look up schedules on drugs. It's sometimes it's insane as like what we have to look at. I mean, some of the examples would be I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the veteran fiduciary issue. It's something that we've been working on.
Yes.
So we've been working on this issue since the 90s. Essentially, the Veteran Affairs Department said anyone that has a financial advisor, a veteran, for their benefits is considered mentally incompetent and therefore is not allowed to own firearms and gets put on the NICS list. Right now, we're looking at about 250,000 veterans on that list. Fortunately for us, last year we were able to stop that. So no veterans are being added. That's about 12,000 a year. I think we came out to the number.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's one of those things where we have to look into mental health. We have to look into the veterans' benefits and what exactly a fiduciary is. And, sometimes it takes, in this case, an actual decade for the problem to get solved. But I think that's one of the greatest things about working here at Gun Owners America. It's not just assault weapons bans. It's not just pistol brace bans that we're looking at. We're looking at every single angle on how to restore all Americans' Second Amendment rights, even if it's a small group like veterans in the greater scheme of America.
Yeah.
It's still very important that we treat all of our citizens the exact same way, rather than treating veterans as second-class citizens for having served this country honorably.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the principle as well. Like, that's the sort of thing that a specific class of people is going to have this infringement. And if it never gets challenged, that infringement is going to be expanded into other markets. It's going to have a more equal distribution eventually. So, yeah, standing up for these principles is vital and important. What are some of the other things that you see happening? Obviously, we're 40 days into Trump presidency number 2. There's quite a bit more time available. Like, how do you see things shaping up across all the areas around this? But ultimately, most of the conversation that's happening around the White House does kind of boil back to this issue of what is the government's role and what is freedom. Even if it's about like who's allowed to send tax money overseas, it still is boiling down to that core fundamental question of, is the government allowed to do this? Like, are random unelected people allowed to even audit the government? Shock, horror. Like that. This is the conversation for the rest of this administration, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's a lot of efficiency. It's a lot of, the freedom argument is where we are. I will say that President Trump, in his campaign promised to sign concealed carry reciprocity if it passes the House and Senate. We're working on ways to make that happen. HPA, the Hearing Protection Act, SHUSH, are both suppressor deregulation that we're also working hard on, and that's something that came up in his last administration, and hopefully we're able to push that across the finish line. But getting more back into the efficiency side, I think a lot of what we're going to look at and see is potentially an undoing of all of the useless programs that the Biden administration pushed out. Programs like the gun storage maps for the Veterans Affairs Administration, in which they're asking veterans to create storage maps of where their guns are, or the Department of Education pushing propaganda on parents saying, hey, you should lock up all your guns and keep them separated, despite the fact that slows down times for a self-defense scenario. And a lot of funding to CDC on anti-gun studies or on community violence intervention programs, like Lotus Hearing. Sorry, this is so ridiculous. I have to say it correctly. Like Lotus Healing Circles, which got about $8 million, I think, in the last Nancy Pelosi omnibus. It's refocusing, efficiency, and looking at the ATF. There's a lot of inefficiency there. There's a lot of wasteful spending. Why are we wasting a third of the budget of the ATF on targeting law-abiding citizens who have a lower crime rate than police officers or at the average citizen? Rather than focusing on that, maybe we need to target actual criminals. And so hopefully this government efficiency and freedom leads to more restoration of Second Amendment rights for the Americans. And we're doing everything we can to push for that forward and to push our mission of no compromise forward as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to how things shake out. There will be lots of distractions. There will be lots of criticism. The good news is that I think if people are bold and they stick to the principles and don't get too bogged down in the weeds of really specific things, I think that is going to, A, resonate with the American people, and B, I think that it will create a lot of positive change that will be a tremendous benefit. It's going to be very interesting to see kind of how things shape up, because the ultimate battle, it does look like it's coming down between the career bureaucrats and then other folks. And again, every administration has always brought in their own people. Like Biden swapped out vast swaths of the directors. This is not something that is unexpected or abnormal. What's unexpected or abnormal is that they kind of start to pare back the people who have an expectation of never having their job questioned. That's something that's pretty new.
Yeah, and it's great. Before, people were saying that we couldn't look at career bureaucrats, we couldn't look at career civil service members because they were protected in some way. But in our cases with the ATF, a lot of these career civil servants weren't actually following the Constitution. They weren't following the American people's desires. And they were attacking the Second Amendment because they saw it as their career and their service to this country, despite the fact it couldn't be anything further. And those are the people that we would like DOJ and the government to look into as, hey, you have people attacking your citizens' rights. You're paying them. They're on your salary. What are we doing here? It's like these are a waste in every single word, in sense of the word.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And even just the way that the enforcement, even if you were to assume that the ATF is the best possible tool to go after the cartels, to go after the gang members, to go after the people who are committing actual crimes with firearms, even if we assume that that was all good and correct, that's just not what's happening. Yeah. So, yeah, more investigation into that I think would be good. How do you see the next few months with Kash Patel addressing the ATF? Because the FBI has a tremendous amount of actual crime to fight, actual justice that they could go and bring to American people. Well, what do you think is going to happen with the ATF? I don't want to imply that the ATF does not have the same opportunities to do justice. I want to say it very deliberately. They don't have the same opportunities to do actual justice because so much of what they're doing is this administrative focus on law-abiding gun owners. How is Kash Patel? How do you see that going?
Well, I think it's hopefully going to be something similar to the FBI. Like you said, the FBI does do actual important law enforcement for preventing terrorism, for going after the cartels. For the ATF, I think there's two ways it could go. It could go either one, they focus a lot more on the border, they focus on the gun running aspect of this, or two, they kind of switch over to a paperwork processing agency in terms of the NFA and the GCA and all the forms for approving FFLs or approving E-forms and Form 4s, Form 1s, but don't necessarily do the enforcement. Instead, it's helping you continue your Second Amendment rights, like the DMV where you sign up for a driver's license or another permit, but not actual the enforcement of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And guns are an interesting issue because while guns themselves, I think firearm freedoms and firearm rights need to be protected by the government because the Second Amendment says that is something that needs to happen. It's a little bit tricky because guns are such a useful tool for all kinds of things. You're going to find all kinds of people that have them. So like people that the DEA is going after, very likely to have guns. Organized crime that the FBI is going after, very likely to have guns. Secret Service that are investigating counterfeiters or large counterfeiting rings, maybe some of those guys are going to have guns. So it is a little bit interesting that we've broken up a lot of responsibilities. The actual enforcement of people using firearms to commit crimes, as opposed to just firearms somehow being a crime unto themselves, that could really easily be given to people who are going after people who are committing actual crimes, and then they can figure out what firearms are being used by these bank robbers, and then they can, figure out if any action needs to be taken on that. And I think that in some ways would be a better way to handle this, as long as there is this understanding that the firearms are a tool, just like the getaway car that the bank robber has, just like the phones that the bank robbers use to figure out which branches were open. Like, they're that kind of tool. They're not a special, magical, intrinsically evil thing that has to be specially controlled, different from cars and guns or cars and money and phones and stuff like that.
No, that's a great point. Our view of this, when we're asked about felons in possession of firearms, it's like, well, if someone's committed such a heinous crime that you don't trust them to have their rights restored for gun rights, but you do trust them to have their rights restored for voting, it's like, why are you letting this person back out into the street if you think they're so dangerous? Because they could they could jump into a car and still hurt people that way, or they could take a baseball bat or a knife and do the exact same thing. But the gun doesn't make the crime any worse. It is simply a crime is being committed with a tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and then on the flip side of that, there's another thing that happens, and I see this a lot amongst otherwise conservative lawmakers or otherwise conservative law enforcement officers. Like here in Tennessee, we have a drug issue. We have a number of people being arrested on drug offenses, and we have law enforcement here in Tennessee who have said, look, the judges just don't take people off the streets for long enough for these drug offenses. But if they have a gun in the car with them, which is likely because this is Tennessee, then the judges put them in prison for longer. We need these special extra enhancements in order to make the streets safer. So look, I understand that you like the Second Amendment. I understand that regular Tennesseans, but just like we don't try to clean up Tennessee's gun laws too much, because we need these enhancements to do actual justice against people because we don't have the tools in another area. And that is so frustrating to me because it's like, we're doing wrong over here, but if you could just let us do two wrongs, that'll make it right somehow. This is the only way that we can convince bad judges to do justice is if we throw this bone of bad gun laws. So I'm sure that that's happening in other states as well, but that's a frustration for me personally here.
No, 100%. We hear the same thing in Congress about how we need to go after drug dealers with guns, different than drug dealers who just have drugs. And we're looking at a lot of people who say this, and it's like, well, why don't you just actually treat drug dealers the same way and focus on the fact that it's a violent crime on its own, and that if they have a knife or they have a gun, it shouldn't matter. They're still committing a violent crime. And in that case, it's like we need to elevate the laws if the police doesn't think it's enough to keep these people off the street.
And focus on things like, well, this guy murdered someone, but the only way that we can keep him in prison is if he used the right implement. It's like, come on, let's.
Murder's bad.
This sounds like a setup for a terrible Norm Macdonald joke. We need to just not let our justice system be that kind of joke. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what does happen, because the beauty of having Trump in office and appointing some of these guys is that there is a level of fearlessness that I am seeing that I don't recall from any other Republican administration that I have seen in my lifetime. And my hope is that will enable us to get to some of the core issues and not just kind of dance around them and try to do the standard partisan stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And, bringing it back to the very beginning, this administration likes to listen to the people. This administration loves hearing from the people. We've seen it on X with Elon Musk looking into certain projects at USAID. We've seen it with, how each of the individual directors and secretaries, they look and they listen to what's being said. They hear it from the ground up. They don't want to hear it from middle management. They don't want to hear it from upper management. They want to hear from the ground what are the issues and how we can improve the overall structure. I think Pete Hegseth is a perfect example of he wants to create war fighters from the ground up. He wants to listen to what these guys at the bottom need rather than potentially what's better for the top of the command structure. And that's something I think this administration as a whole is pushing is we want to listen to the people. We want to create efficiency. How can we do this? And for gun rights, that's great, is we can really push the grassroots, and that's us, that's you, me, that's everyone listening, that's your family, that's your coworkers, that's your gun buddies at the range, all of that to help the president and the entire administration go forward and get rid of inefficiencies, get rid of infringements, and restore the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Well, one of the beauties about annoying, there's the downside to annoying the career bureaucrats. They've been there a long time. They have a home court advantage. But one of the beauties of it is once you annoy them and they stop working with you, and you stop trusting them, you start listening to the people. So I think that is an interesting benefit. So I want to recommend that everybody head over to the GOA website to see some of the issues that are pending. And we have a few more days before the Attorney General is supposed to lay out a plan for protecting the Second Amendment rights of Americans. So we have a few more days to tell people up in her office, up in the White House, what some of our priorities are. So we've talked about this a lot at T-Rex, but we don't have the best mechanism. I mean, we have told you to go write directly to the White House, call the White House on the phone. I think I gave the wrong number. I think there's a switchboard that you can call, and there's also a way to leave messages. I think I gave people the message box, but I think that's better. I think people are afraid to call the White House because they're afraid that, like, J.D. Vance might answer, and so you can call and leave a message. No pressure leaving messages. Nothing to be afraid of. But yeah, leaving messages, writing directly to your representatives in Congress. But then GOA has all sorts of opportunities to send letters and things, and have got some specific stuff lined up, which I think is great, because even if you have a fantastic idea that the White House should 100% totally listen to, but you're the only one with that idea, it's much easier if you will push along an idea that has a little bit more traction as you develop that idea and share it with other people. So at some point, Ben, we'll talk about my idea for a gun rights czar. It's a scary thing to create another office for the government, but it's the government's job is to be protecting the rights of the people more than just creating larger, more powerful governments to protect the people from themselves. So that would be one possible extra czar that I might be okay with. So we can talk about that in a future episode. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate the work that you are doing now and all the work that you've done in the past. Keep us posted if there's stuff that we can do. We'll continue to mention projects that you guys are doing, both in DC and Tennessee. I think we actually have some really interesting legislation here in Tennessee. Most of it's small, but you guys brought a really good bill. I'm glad that you guys wrote it instead of us, because it does benefit. It benefits gun companies. I don't know that it specifically benefits T-Rex. We don't sell guns, but I didn't want people to think that particular gun bill was something that we wrote to benefit ourselves. But we're going to push the bill that you guys suggested to a couple of friendly sponsors here in Nashville. So I'm looking forward to the rest of session, and I think it's the end of March that is the Gun Owners of America and Tennessee Freedom Association Lobby Day. So we'll probably talk about that as we get closer, because it's already March.
Yeah, time's flying fast when you're having fun and winning.
Yeah, I'm not tired of the winning yet, but I am a little bit tired of how fast things are going. There's a lot of stuff to catch up on.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So I appreciate what you guys are doing. Here at T-Rex, we like to say that this is an area where we work. It's an area we're passionate about, but we're also usually pretty distracted by other business-related stuff. The advocacy stuff and the lobbying stuff is harder to make time for. So I'm tremendously grateful for what you guys are doing, and the sheer amount of time and effort that your lobbyists, your lawyers, your organizers are spending on this issue, because it's tremendously important to have people who are this focused.
Yeah, well, we appreciate all of your support as well, and the support of everyone listening. This job would be almost impossible to do without your help and the grassroots support. That's really what gives us power here in DC, is the fact that if we put out an alert and half of our members call, the offices freak out, and they constantly come back running to us as like, what can we change? What can we do? So that really is a kick in the butt for a lot of people.
Yeah, very good. Well, there's no shortage. I thought you were going to say that I was going to say there's no shortage of kicking that needs to be done, but I'll be polite. There's no shortage of work that needs to be done. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I appreciate this really fascinating opportunity that Trump has given us to weigh in before the plan is made. And there's always the possibility, not to make it too urgent, but there is always the possibility that because Second Amendment stuff is not his biggest focus, it's not the biggest issue that he campaigned on, it's not the thing that he's getting attacked on the most, it's very possible that this plan that comes out on March 9th will kind of be the Second Amendment gun focus for the next 3 years. It may not get quite as much attention. So I think it is really important that we hit this issue hard for the next week. Then again, I'm sure that there will be scandals and issues and things that happen over the next 4 years that bring it back into the limelight, so to speak.
Yeah, I can say on top of lobbying with this executive order and talking to the administration and with Congress, Gun Owners America is not going to stop just at whatever this executive order says. We're going to keep pushing the no compromise mission however much we can.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for everything that you're doing. And I appreciate having this conversation on the podcast. I've loved talking with you in person. It's fun to talk. It's fun to talk on the podcast, too. As well. So I appreciate you making the time today. And then, maybe when things are less pressing, specific things, we could have a longer cultural, philosophical, historical conversation sometime. I think that would be good too.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. It's great to see you as always.